Thank you, Anna, for being here doing this interview.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Thank you so much. And I think we could start this interview by asking some questions about your compositional process. Especially when I heard at first your music, I started with your release Clockwise. The first thing that bumped me up was the concentration and the research that surely you made on timbre. And this interests me a lot. So as a first question from this interview, what the first thing that made you concentrate so much on this aspect, and how you develop those concepts on timbre?
Yeah, well, for Clockwise, the concept of the album came from I was studying mostly classical 20th century percussion music. And that was actually sort of a remnant of an earlier band that I had, this septet called Percussive Mechanics. Yeah. That was this band based in Germany. Anyway, to give you sort of all of the backstory, we were going to do a third album with that band. In the middle of planning that, the label actually stopped existing. Oh. And so that recording session was canceled, and it had been just becoming a little bit harder and harder to do tours with that band because I was based in New York and the rest of the band was based in Germany. So, and then several of the other people from the band had moved out of Germany, so it was just like between flight tickets and all this stuff, it was getting to be a little bit unmanageable. Anyway, so the point of all that being that I had sort of decided to study percussion music because that band had two drummers. Oh. And I was interested in, like, I guess, figuring out how to write for two drummers better. I felt like I'd done 2 records and kind of gotten to the end of what I could do without any further study. So yeah, I was in the middle of doing research and basically like listening to all these classical percussion pieces pretty in depth, like with scores, and then reading a bunch of stuff that the composers had written about these pieces, reading some things that other scholars had written about these pieces, and then sort of switched direction band-wise. So instead of having it be for my group Percussive Mechanics, I decided to write for a new group based out of New York. Anyway, so I felt like the idea of studying percussion music was still valid, and brought up a few interesting questions. And one of those is, how do you construct a piece where timbre is the most important thing? You know, not that timbre is necessarily like the most important thing in the pieces that I ended up writing, but in percussion music, it you know, basically is. Like, you don't have a traditional melody how we think about it. You don't have harmony how we think about it. You do have those things, just in different contexts. So how do the sounds themselves and the timbres and these more like complex sounds than just single pitches, how do they create melody and harmony within themselves? So that's sort of like how I got to the place of deciding that the album was going to be more about timbre than some of the things I had done previously. And then within that, as I was preparing to write music, I really felt this need to push my compositional language forward a little bit. And that was coming from this place of just noticing a disconnect between how I was improvising, which was a lot of extended techniques, a lot of sort of, you know, more timbral things, and then how I was composing. And basically when I sat down to write music, I was like, okay, cool, 12 pitches, rhythms, let's go. And so wanted to find some place where those two could meet. And a good place for that was to like look at the sounds that my instruments made. And okay, what are the sounds that are maybe a little bit out of the ordinary that my instrument makes? And then to also think about the other instruments I was writing for. And yeah, basically, I guess to after the research part of this project of Clockwise, where I was studying all these classical percussion scores, the next thing was thinking about all of the instruments that I was writing for as creators of sound. What are the interesting sounds that a trombone makes, like just kind of make a list of them. What are the interesting sounds that that clarinet makes, or tenor saxophone makes, or piano makes, or bass makes, and obviously still having the pitch material available, but then recognizing that I could also draw from that pool of sounds too.
Yeah, cool. I really appreciate and find really interesting this approach on analyzing the spectrum of each instruments that will be actually available on the ensemble. And that reminds me a lot of the as a sort of the spectral school, no, of composing, like having a deep focus on the spectrum, but actually evolving the concept on another direction.
Yeah, I've certainly studied a lot of music from the spectral school. It's definitely a slightly different direction. I have done some spectral analysis of sounds and then come up with a way of creating that with other instruments. But in the case of Clockwise, at least, a lot of it was more done just by ear. Like, okay, well, here's a sound that the tenor saxophone makes, like a slap tongue, for example, where you have like a sound. What is a similar sound that the trombone makes? And then how can I both combine those to make a unison, or combine them in, like take this one attack from the saxophone and combine it with this longer thing from the trombone and make something that actually sounds much more mysterious and like you can't really tell what's going on.
Okay, super. And I found interesting to talk more about Clockwise. I heard some approach by using quarter tones, like on Idiom 2 or Idiom second.
Yeah, Idiom 2. Yeah.
Idiom 2. How do you work? Because it's not the most obvious way to utilize quarter tones, no? So I thought that at first you utilize the two tenor saxophones combined to have a sort of another timbre effect, maybe. Can you talk more about Idiom 2, how you work on composing?
Yeah, the first part is not so much about quarter tones, but about the physicality of the tenor saxophone.
Okay.
And what happens when there's all these little things like little microtonal zones that happen when you play a fingering for one pitch, and then maybe you hold an extra key down and then go through a whole series of other pitches. So that's basically what that piece was I believe that there's both the tenors have kind of the same part in terms of what their fingers are doing, but each of us has a different venting. So either holding a note open or holding a key down. And that creates this interesting microtonal, sort of parallel-ish microtonal sound world that it's not really quarter tones. It's really just somewhere in between. Notation-wise, I wasn't super concerned with what the actual pitches of that that resulted from that. I was more concerned with just like the physicality of the instrument and what does this instrument want to do? What does this instrument do? What does it sound like when you like sort of make it malfunction in a way? And then for the end of that piece, both the parts of the piece, I sort of think of this of Idiom 2 as in two parts. There's the first part that has the tenor saxophone like
Exactly.
and then and then there's like this block chord section at the end. And both of these came from little improvisations that I had done. And that's not my normal way of writing. That actually sort of took a little bit of a leap of faith for me to start with my improvisations, but it was an interesting way of, as I was saying, bringing my improvisatory language and my compositional language closer together by literally using something that I had improvised as the cell for a piece. So the end part was something that I improvised actually when I played duo with Chess Smith, the drummer on the record.
Awesome.
And yeah, it was just like a little kind of 5/8 quarter tony thing. And so I just took that and improvised a little bit of it an expansion to that, and ended up being a lot of quarter tones in sort of a off kilter odd meter thing. And then I took that and I basically came up with a parallel voicing that I felt worked with quarter tones through that. And it's always an interesting thing writing quarter tones when you have sort of an ensemble that has half fixed pitch instruments, or instruments that cannot play quarter tones, such as the piano, without serious retuning and work that I wasn't planning to do. And instruments that are much more flexible with pitch. And also just like, how does that work when you have the saxophone, which sort of you have fingerings and okay, this is a quarter tone, but it's maybe not an exact quarter tone. And then you have instruments like brass instruments that are much more like just intonation based.
Yeah, sure.
And then you have like, the bass or a stringed instrument where you can kind of just adjust where your fingers are and get, any sort of color within the range of the instrument. Yeah, anyway, so that's basically what that was. And then I figured out that the beginning worked over the end.
Yeah, sure.
But yeah, it was definitely in terms of thinking about quarter tones, less coming from a perspective of like having a 24 tone aggregate scale, and more from a perspective of how does microtonality work sort of in the wild, like how does it function just like on these instruments when you're not even thinking about it.
Sure. And as you said, by Idiom being written by thinking of the physicality of the tenor saxophone, it made totally sense with the title as an idiomatic way of composing a piece.
Yeah, I actually have a record coming out.
I'll
plug it right now, called Idiom, and that's the rest of the Idiom pieces.
Awesome.
It's coming out in May on Pi, and the first record is all my trio, which is John Hollenbeck and Matt Mitchell and myself.
Wonderful.
And that's Idiom 1, 3, 4, and 5. And then I have a large ensemble, and that's doing Idiom 6, which is a set length composition.
Also, the large ensemble would be released in the same album?
Yeah, it's going to be a double CD.
Wonderful. Really interested to hear it.
Yeah, and it's all basically that kind of concept where I was taking stuff that feels like very idiomatic to each instrument, or to specifically my instruments, tenor, saxophone, and flute, and expanding those and seeing what happens when I use those sounds as basis for whole compositions.
Wonderful. And by talking more about microtonality, quarter tones, what are your main influences on those concepts? By talking on 20th century composers and stuff like that.
Yeah, that's a good question. I feel like there's a lot of stuff. I started just working on quarter tones just out of kind of curiosity. I sort of knew they existed, and then I figured out all these fingerings without really knowing what their place was within the tradition of music at all. And then from there, actually, a good friend of mine, saxophonist composer Eric Hove, who's based out of Montreal, he started this band where he was doing a lot of research into spectral composition, and I played in that group, and he sort of like was a catalyst for me to get into the like spectral composition study world, and also just to figure out, okay, how do quarter tones work? And obviously, like in jazz, Steve Lehman is obviously a person who's done a lot of work on that, and kind of brought it into like, I guess, the collective language in many ways. But yeah, I mean, like I spent a lot of time with Griset's music, but then also a lot of 20th century composers who've been writing with quarter tones, like Ligeti is a great influence on me. Xenakis. Yeah, like I guess those two for that kind of stuff for sure. Yeah, I guess it's just been something that I've always liked the sound, and then have sort of like backpedaled a little bit and figured out that, oh yeah, there's all these music traditions like in the world that have been, not using
Utilizing.
standard, like what we think of as standard in, Western Europe and North America intonation systems. So then, yeah, I wouldn't say that like that I have a great base of knowledge about like music from Iran or whatever, but I definitely have appreciated learning about that stuff and seeing how like quarter tones are used in that music. Yeah, so
Wonderful.
that's kind of it. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Like I found some connections on titles from your compositions. Like I've read that core is based on
Yeah,
on Zenaki's composition for percussion, six percussionists.
yeah, Persefasa.
Yeah,
It's I pronounce it Kora because that's actually another Persefasa is the the word that we know most or frequently in that we use most frequently in English is Persephone.
yeah,
Um, and Kora is another name for Persephone or
yeah.
Persefasa.
And the,
Yeah,
and
so
the,
Xenakis,
and
a big influence.
the same thing with rebounds for
Yeah,
the Weber Harris Big Band project.
yeah,
There
yeah.
are
That's a lot. That's a lot more of a direct connection right there.
yeah, and
Uh,
for another composition like King of Dermarks,
hmm
um, you've talked about the same composition by Morton Feldman, and there
hmm
is actually influence on this composition by Morton Feldman, and how he,
Yeah,
yeah, please,
yeah. The Morton Feldman composition is basically a graphic score with a grid.
yeah,
That's what the score is. Uh, and that's another piece for percussion that I was looking at as I wrote the music on Clockwise. And yeah, the long story is that I had written all these little interludes that were just sort of text pieces that we recorded in the studio, and those were not King of Denmark necessarily. They were just little extra things to record. Then once I had all the recording session done and I was looking at all the raw material, I still wanted to do these interludes, but I decided to chop up the stuff that we'd recorded for these interludes a little bit. So the connection for me with King of Denmark, the Morton Feldman piece, is that I was using I use Logic to do like more electronic stuff, and was basically thinking of Logic as like a grid, sort of like a graphic, like a, I don't know, 21st century graphic composition type thing.
yeah,
So that's sort of the connection there. On Clockwise, there's 3 King of Denmark pieces, and 2 of them are pieces where I chopped up other recordings that we had done. One of them is all Chess Smith, one of them is all Chris Tordini, and I took various takes and various different interlude pieces and sort of chopped them up and put them together. Yeah, so that's where that came from.
and on the, I think is the first part of King of Denmark, the maybe the last part, if I remember correctly, where there is a sort of chorale.
Uh-huh.
It is derived from the composition of Morton Feldman, or is it just something that you add to the composition?
Yeah, I think perhaps what you're referring to is that I have on the record King of Denmark and this other piece called Loper are
Yeah.
connected. Loper is not based on
Okay. Okay.
on the King of Denmark piece. That's actually sort of very, very loosely based on this piece by Perez called Ionization.
Ionization. Yeah.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Wonderful.
Yeah.
And by talking about some another release that you made with the trio with John Allenbeck and Matt Mitchell, Binary.
Mm-hmm.
I've read a lot, like a lot of interviews that you made on this release when you talk of non-conventional techniques for composing. like utilizing the Morse code or your IP address. Did you find like other non-conventional techniques that you eventually used in some other composition that you already released, or that you maybe will release in the future?
Yeah, I think so. The way that I wrote, at least the first two records I did with Simple Trio, was through what I think of as generative processes, where I was using like, so the first record, Simple, was, as you said, mostly using Morse code, and then the second record, Binary, was using just kind of anything that I found on the internet that I thought was interesting. And I wasn't doing that out of any sort of like real deep connection to those materials, more just because I feel like sometimes it's helpful for me, and still is helpful for me, to have a way of, like, you can have all these ideas for writing music. This happens to me a lot, where I'm just like, oh yeah, I have all this music that I need to write like in a month, and I'm just like, yeah, it'll be cool, like I can do this and this and this and this, and I'm even writing these ideas down, but then I come to the day where I have to start writing, and I sit down at my desk, and I have a lot of ideas, but how do I get pitches to then go with those ideas, or how do I get rhythms to go with those ideas? So it's a way that I found to be helpful for just like kind of getting over writer's block in a way, or getting over that first hump where I'm sitting in front of a piece of blank manuscript paper, and maybe I have this idea for like how I want the form to go, but I don't have any specific ideas for pitches. I don't have any melodies or harmonies or anything. And you can, obviously, many people do, and I do this too, sit down at your instrument or at the piano or wherever, voice, and come up with something that you like. But I find that it has been helpful for me to have something that like just helps me to get started, and that also takes me away from the stuff that my ear would normally be drawn to.
Okay.
Not because I don't trust my ear, but because I feel like, if I sit down at the piano to write music, I'm not a very good piano player, so everything will kind of end up sounding the same.
Yeah.
But if I decide like, okay, I'm going to use my IP address, I'm going to like, how can I use this sequence of, I actually forget how many numbers are in an IP address, maybe 9. If I use the sequence of random numbers, like how can I be creative with this and have it like turn into pitches or rhythms somehow? And then I take that and I hear what it sounds like, and then from there I start using my ear to like develop something that's bigger than that. But that's just been a way for me, more or less, of getting from the blank manuscript paper to having something on the manuscript paper to work with. And I've the Clockwise was sort of more about the percussion pieces than about generative processes like that. But I still use those, and I kind of use them on and off in whatever I do. I like kind of making a compositional language that works for the world of each piece. So, for instance, the piece Clockwise on the record Clockwise, I made a cipher out of the word Zyklus, which is the Stockhausen piece that this piece is that piece is loosely based on. So I just like applied a letter to each, an alphabet letter to, or sorry, a note letter to each of the letters in the word Zyklus, and then came up with rhythms and pitches from there. So yeah, I still use things like that, but I haven't done anything recently where I've just like said, okay, this one collection of numbers is going to be how I generate this. But I definitely find it useful for organizing and to make sure that everything feels a little bit connected.
Sure.
Yeah.
Like sometimes the post process after finding those concepts is what makes it sound good, actually. So
yeah,
as you said, sometimes not to have an only strict way to compose. Like I have a series of pitch, I have a series of rhythm. That's it. Like the process that comes after make it actually good for you.
Yeah.
And
I mean, I think that's something that I think about a lot. Like, when you talk about having a generative process like this, like you can see that as like, well, all the work's kind of already done for you, but that's definitely not the
no,
case. If you think of like a 12 tone row, that if you have a 12 tone row, you still have to do something with it. Like,
absolutely.
I'm not going to come up with Schoenberg's music if I have the same 12 tone row as him. It really is still like on the creativity and uh, yeah, just explorations of the composer to really do something that actually takes sort of raw material and turns it into music.
Absolutely. Like as you named 12 tone music, I was recently finding about the time point system
Mm,
used by Milton Babbitt and after
mm,
uh, evolved by Charles Warren.
mm.
And by studying it from the simple composition book by Charles Warren, I was like, yeah, it sounds good, but there is something else they have to do with it.
Yeah,
So, or sometimes you have just some little fragments or cells that will eventually grow and become an actual composition.
hmm,
And move on, I was actually curious on how you balanced uh, in your own composition, like composition and improvisation. Like, of course, in some part there is a strict indication of, I think, chord changes, like on Clockwise,
hmm.
but like some other parts, how you manage to organize the improvisation part in your own composition?
Yeah, that's something I think about a lot, and it's something that I don't take for granted within a composition. I think it's been important to me to remember that that improvisation isn't something that has to happen within a piece. It's something that can happen within a piece, even when you're writing for improvisers. Um, on the other side of that, when I first started getting really serious about composition, I was questioning like why would I why would I include improvisation in a piece of music that I spend like, sometimes months just like working on these little details, and then I'm just going to let somebody take it and, do whatever they want with it. After having that opinion, maybe just for a couple months or something, I was like, wait, I actually do really I am an improviser. It makes me happy to improvise. I like playing with improvisers. I want them to be happy. They're happy when they improvise. Um, it feels very important to me to have that. But also within that, I've kind of realized that improvisation is much more than just a solo feature. There's a whole range of it, and I think a lot of times, you know, in looser band contexts, you go through this whole range of things without even really thinking about them. But sometimes in more composed music, it's easier to forget that there is a whole spectrum between fully composed and fully improvised,
Sure.
or fully composed and solo feature over the rhythm section playing an accompaniment. And so I try to utilize all of these different, um, I guess, like levels of improvisation within my pieces and think, okay, like a lot of it is about keeping the people that I play with happy and making them feel engaged and connected to the music and give them, a sense of ownership. Um, and the other side of that being me completely trusting the musicians that I play with to make my music better than I could have imagined. Um, and a lot of it is just because, yeah, I think it's interesting to come up with ways of like sort of blurring those hard lines between what is composed and what's improvised. So like for example, just to like go back to traditional jazz, we do have levels of improvisation within even just like playing a jazz standard. If somebody's taking a solo, the piano player or guitar player or whoever is comping, and that's like basically accompanying a very strict set of rules. Like the notes are basically predefined. Um, you have chord changes. You know which pitches fit. The rhythm is defined. Um, you know where you are supposed to stand in relationship to the soloist. So if you take that into a more, I guess, like modern context, or the kind of music that I make, you can come up with those same things. Like I could control, maybe there's a featured soloist, but then like 2 or 3 people have some controls on what they're doing, but it's still improvised. So like you can play these 2 or 3 notes, you can play these kinds of rhythms, you can play these sorts of timbres, and you can do whatever you want with those, but you have to stay lower in level than the main featured soloist. Or maybe there isn't a featured soloist, but you still have those kinds of controls on what somebody is doing. So that, I guess that's kind of the like basic way that I think about improvisation, is that it doesn't have to be a binary like on or off switch, you know, like there's a lot of different things in between, even to the level of like, here's a melody, interpret this melody how you want to interpret it, or come in with this whenever you want. Like I think thinking about improvisation as the composer asks the performer to make a decision is sort of a much more open way of thinking about it than, I guess, what I used to think about it as, which was basically just you get a solo or you don't get a solo.
Sure. And I've read that sometimes you like try to think all the possible combinations that would eventually come out of those improvisation. But when you write those composition, do you have like the musician that would eventually play it or would eventually improvise? Like for Clockwise, some part where there is a piano improvisation, did you compose it by having like Matt Mitchell in mind?
Yeah, almost
Sure.
always. I have a really hard time writing for not specific people. I feel like 2 piano players are completely different. Like it's hard
Absolutely.
to 2 saxophone players are completely different. Like I wouldn't write the same thing for, you know, these like person A and person B. It's almost like it's a completely different instrument. Not entirely, but those are like pieces in terms of
Sure.
my compositional process. I have a real hard time just, you know, coming up with ideas if I don't know who it is.
Sure.
So yeah, those are very, very much connected for me.
And I was actually curious that I know that you studied with John Hollenbeck in Berlin. So I was like curious to know more about how it was to study with him and how it was his approach on teaching composition. Like I I can expect that it's not like having the traditional way of teaching composition. Here is an arrangement or stuff like that. So how it was, how he helped you to actually even evolve your language.
Yeah, it was extremely helpful, and John is somebody that I consider to be, you know, a long-standing mentor of mine at the time.
Oh, okay.
I'd done actually a previous master's degree. It's my second master's degree that I was doing, and so you know I'd already done all the like jazz arranging classes. I knew what a drop 2 and drop 4 voicing
Sure.
was, and I didn't wasn't really interested in that. What I was interested in was writing stuff that sounded less cookie cutter than what I'd been writing before, and having the skills to create music even when I didn't have like that lightning bolt inspiration thing. Um, yeah, and he has a lot of tools for, yeah, like staying creative, for organizing your way of thinking about writing music, and for yeah, like getting over places where you don't know where to go next. And I took a lot out of my lessons with him, for
Sure. Uh, uh, did he actually like suggest some books from the 20th century literature of
Yeah, I actually read that Warren book on his recommendation.
yeah.
For
Great to know
example.
it.
uh Yeah, I feel like there were some other ones. Uh, I mean, I read some counterpoint books. I think he gave me some counterpoint book titles at some point. Schoenberg and um, the books one. Um, but yeah, mostly the the way of learning was less like studying other
Sure.
people's music and more like I had as part of this degree program, I was supposed to be writing music for a septet,
Okay.
which became percussive mechanics. And so it was sort of through me like working on stuff and then like getting input on how to, okay, well, you're here, but like, and you're kind of stuck. So how do you get past that? Or you're, that's fine. You could leave it like that, but what if you like pushed it a
Sure.
little bit farther? And I got a lot about just like how far you can push a piece of music. Um, how do you take your music from being like fine to being excellent? What length of time is acceptable to work on a composition? Like I think previously I'd been sort of in this like jazz school zone where I would, if it wasn't a lead sheet, I felt like I was, you know, it was way too much to spend like a week on a piece of music.
Oh,
That just seemed crazy. And so just, for me that it was like kind of life changing to be like, oh no, you can spend time on this. It's okay.
sure.
Yeah.
Sure. Another aspect that I really found interesting is how you actually utilize extended techniques on the saxophone. So what I was wondering if you can tell a little bit more about how you first approach to extended techniques and what are your influences on utilizing how you after managed to utilize those techniques on composition.
How what my approach to learning the extended techniques was?
Yeah, and then how you managed to organize these materials
Yeah.
on an actual composition level.
Yeah, well, I think for me a lot of uh, the extended technique practice on my instruments came way, way, way before I was ever writing music that incorporated those. As I said, like when I started learning quarter tones, it was a long time ago. I was in, it was, probably like around 10 years before I actually wrote a piece with any quarter tones in it, which is not to say that most people need that gestation period, but I did. um, and same thing goes for the other extended technique things like multiphonics is something that I've spent a
Sure.
lot of time studying, and like using circular breathing as a performer. All of these things were really like my personal instrumental practice that I really like spent a lot of time getting together, either mostly through like self-study. I didn't spend a lot of time with like books on how to do this. I would just hear somebody do a thing and then figure out how to do it. With multiphonics, I was like, okay, here's a multiphonic. Um, I would look at scores and see like, oh, this multiphonic is used here. Like, oh, what if I like lift my pinky finger on my right hand? Does that make something else happen? Okay, and then just sort of create my own directory of multiphonics that way. Um, and that sort of goes for all of the extended technique stuff that I use. I really spent a lot of time figuring out how they worked on my instrument and cataloging things just on my own for my own improvisational practice. Um, and then in terms of bringing them into my compositional world, a lot of it was that thing that I was saying, where I just sort of realized, wait, there is a real rift between what I do as a composer and what I do as an improviser. But a lot of it is like not wanting to write something before I felt like I had mastered it. Or if I did, um, I do think you should, or I try to write things that I haven't fully mastered, so that they can help me grow. But I think there's also like I didn't want to put something into a piece just because it was a cool sound. I wanted to do it because it was truly the thing that I felt like was the right thing for this context and something that I felt like I had some sort of ownership over. That I felt like I knew how to control it. I knew what it was going to be and what it was going to sound like and where it would fit. Um, So approaching extended techniques less from like a that's a cool sound perspective and more from a like um, what does this mean to me, I guess.
Sure, like a way to assimilate in a way that you eventually would utilize in a natural way.
Hmm.
So it would come the time when you need this sound in your composition, or when you are improvising and not just utilizing because you know how to do it.
Yeah, yeah, or even like writing it and not really understanding it and
Sure.
putting it into a piece like without. I think I hesitated for a really long time writing a piece with quarter tones because I didn't think that I had a good enough understanding of how to use it in a piece that wasn't kind of silly.
Okay.
Um, Especially compared to the people that, you know, like I mentioned earlier, are using it in very like studied studied ways. I didn't want to be writing it in a way that's just like, look, there's an extra note between D and E flat.
Yeah.
um, yeah, so I wanted to make sure that I had a real like control over what the material was and how I was using it.
Sure. And uh, but talking more about your compositional process, as you said before, you're something that you were working on is utilize improvisation material
Hmm.
and take some cells or segment and then eventually develop a new composition.
Hmm.
Can you talk more about this process? Like there is a you record yourself improvising. Like I remember something that was actually similar utilized by Steve Coleman, some of his latest composition where he's just record himself improvising on the saxophone and then transcribing it, utilize those transcription to eventually make a new composition and then orchestrate for different instruments. So
Yeah,
in the case of you, how
that's
you,
that's yeah. I was gonna say that's a very extreme way of doing it. I think what I know that Steve Coleman has been doing. For me, it's less like here's a complete improvisation, like let me transcribe it and now it's a piece, um, and more of a like here, okay, what is a sound that I might use while I'm improvising, or like I don't record myself improvising super frequently, um, but sometimes you know I do, and then maybe I'll own in on one little section like, oh, that little thing is cool, but I didn't quite get it. Like, so maybe I can take that little thing that I didn't quite get and figure out what it was and figure out how to make it better. And then writing it down, and then maybe after I've written it down, I'm like, actually, like, I feel like that I could even expand on that farther. Um, so yeah, I think for me, it's less like complete improvisations that then become compositions, and more like I would say for me more often than not, it's actually just like what are some sounds that I do use while I'm improvising, rather than recording an improvisation or even a fragment of an improvisation, with the exception of Idiom 2, which was very much that. But then I would even I would like some of the stuff that I've done too is like, okay, here's a thing that I do use while I'm improvising. Now let me improvise for 2 or 3 minutes using only that thing. So sort of like taking it out of the context of how I would maybe use it naturally, where maybe you know you go to a sound and then you go to another thing and you go to another thing. Say like, what can I do if I really just focus on this for a while, and then like record that or write it down. Like maybe play a little bit, write it down, play a little bit, write it down. So more like a continuum between the improvisation side of things and the uh, composition side of things.
okay, so like extrapolating some concept and utilizing it as a restriction oriented way for actually mm, like practice and develop some new concepts.
Yeah, totally,
So
totally.
awesome, awesome.
Mhm.
So that eventually came the next question that
Mhm.
is totally related. So how is your, if you have, of course, like a practice routine or how do you approach on practice new concepts? How they eventually came in your mind?
Yeah, I have a pretty strict, I would say, practice routine. Um, I just try to like touch a lot of different topics over whatever the amount of time that I have to practice in a given day is. You know, one of those things being keeping the technical aspect of things in shape, so have some sort of like technical exercise that I'm working on. But then also like, okay, maybe a section of my practice would be for developing an extended technique or a type of sound. Right now I'm working on just intonation stuff when I'm
Oh,
practicing.
wonderful.
Yeah, so mostly just playing along with drones, and a friend of mine made a Maximus P patch that allows you to get a bunch of like sort of JI ratios between low 20s and single digits, so you can kind of just hear what those sound like and then tune along with those. So yeah, a lot of just figuring out where the next thing that I want to work on is, like in the sound world or extended technique world, and going into that direction. But also, I mean, right now I think a lot of what I'm just trying to keep up my ability to improvise and interact with people, which is, I think, for everybody pretty hard right now.
Of
When we
course.
can't play together. Uh, I know some people have been able to do live streams. I've done a couple of live streams, but it's not really enough to feel in shape with that stuff. So I've
Sure.
been playing along with records and playing along with like play along recordings and stuff like that, just to just to keep that muscle um, in shape. Because otherwise, I think like yeah, I would feel pretty scared to go back to playing with people at the end
Sure.
of this. So yeah, under normal circumstances, a lot of my practice is like learning the music that I have to learn for the next gig. But right now, I'm spending a lot of time like just sight reading, keeping the improv muscle strong, and working on long tones in just intonation.
Uh,
Yeah.
I I found it very interesting this aspect on just intonation.
Mhm.
So, do you utilize like alternate fingerings for the saxophone, or you pitch bend the note?
Yeah, I know that a lot of people have mapped out like pretty specific, up until you know, uh, how I 8 or more microtones per half step or whatever. Um, this guy that I actually went to school at the Jazz Institute Berlin with, Philip Gerschlauer, I know has mapped out like 128 notes for
Yeah.
the octave.
Yeah.
Um, that's not really my approach. My approach is more, I have quarter tone fingering, so for uh, the so I use those and then bending the
Okay.
pitch. So like for a just intonation major third, which if people are unaware is slightly lower than an equal tempered major third, that's like close enough where you can really just bend the pitch. Even for a just intonation seven partial, like 7-4 ratio, that's 30 cents lower than equal tempered, but it's still doable with a combination of lips
Quarter
and
tones.
quarter tone fingerings when you need it. So that's my approach is more like doing it by ear, really being able to feel what those intervals feel like and how they resonate and what the difference tones are, more than finding like the exact precise fingering that will work for it. But that's my own personal approach to it. I know that other people wouldn't agree with me on that.
So yeah, awesome, awesome. So, uh, would you eventually develop this concept on just intonation to compose some new pieces? Do you do you actually already compose something with it?
Yeah, I'm working on it. I just wrote 3 pieces for big band that are what I'm calling just intonation etudes.
Oh,
Uh, I think part of the issue with using just intonation in a jazz context is that a lot of people are completely unfamiliar with it and
sure.
what it feels like, what it sounds like. So I was trying to come up with a way of sort of teaching my band how to do it in a way that feels like doable, and that means long notes, and it means telling people exactly how to, like, I wrote a primer of how to do it. It means also mostly using brass instruments for
Sure.
the more, like, the higher partials. Um, yeah, so I'm working on it. I'm actually at this place, the American Academy Berlin, for this, I guess, semester, doing research into just intonation,
Oh,
and
wonderful.
what the practical applications for that in at least my own composition might be. A lot of people have done tons of research on that before. I definitely know that I'm, it's not groundbreaking or anything, but I think just the practicality of it within the jazz world, and the skill sets that jazz musicians have, like where is it, um, where is it usable and practical, and what can be learned quickly, and what maybe is a little bit like you need an electronic instrument to do. And
Sure, sure.
yeah.
Like I actually find it really interesting this application in a more jazz avant-garde point of view. Like
Hmm.
as you said, there are other composers there, like Mark Sabat
Hmm.
or Catherine Lamb
Yeah.
or James Tenney
Hmm.
who have working on it, but with another like aesthetic.
Hmm.
So I, it will be really cool to listen to it.
I hope so. I mean, I haven't. We'll see. I feel like all the composition everybody's doing right now is somewhat hypothetical.
Sure,
I haven't. We'll see what happens when I actually get to play with people again.
sure. And as you talk on a big band, can you like tell about the Weber Harris big band, the story behind it? How do you approach composing for this
Hmm.
project?
Yeah, it's actually the Weber Morris big
Sorry.
band. That's okay. I mean, it's not my Matt. It's my friend Angela Morris. Her last name. Yeah, Angela and I met in New York City several years ago, and we're both kind of in the same corners of the music scene in terms of just being interested in similar things, but then also kind of had this like secret side obsession, which was writing music for big band. Both of us were in this thing called the BMI Composers Workshop, which a lot of people who write big band music out there right now have been through that program. It was started by Bob Brookmeyer in the 80s, I believe. Anyway, so yeah, Angela and I just kind of like, neither of us really wanted to have our own band, but we also wanted to have a band where we could hear the music that we were writing played by the people that we were hearing playing it. So we just sort of combined forces and decided to do a gig of our big band music, and then that was really fun. So then we started doing more gigs, and then it became a thing where we've been running a big band now for, I guess, like 6 years. And compositionally, I mean, I don't really think writing for big band is so much different than writing for other ensembles, or at least I'm not necessarily approaching it in. I don't like put on my big band hat. I'm not like changing the kind of music that I
Sure,
want to write. There are some challenges. One of those challenges is rehearsal time. You're just never going to get the kind of like focused rehearsal time that you would get in a small group, just because there's so many more people,
sure,
and so many more songs, and all of the songs are much more composed. So you really have to not. You just have to consider the fact that you might not have um, the amount of time to get the hardest possible thing um, done. And the other thing is, yeah, just like making sure everybody feels happy, and that they're getting some chances to improvise. Making sure that the brass players have enough breaks for their lips. Uh, yeah, I mean, aside from that, I think I try to just write the music that I want to write for big band. And something that I like doing is trying to make the big band sound less like a big band and more like a chamber orchestra or something.
sure.
Um, I find the like stereotypical sound of the big band not to be super compelling to my own ears. So I tend to write in ways that like erase that a little bit, for better or for worse. Yeah.
Sure. And yeah, as you, by listening to your music, and I found like a deep connection with 20th century composer music,
Hmm.
and even more than other composers of the same scene. So what I was wondering is what it was the first thing that make you want to pursue like this sound and those concepts, like what it was your first experience listening to it.
Yeah, it's a good question. I feel like I was sort of late to the game with classical music. I never really listened to it until I was in grad school. I was listening to jazz, and then I, I went to Manhattan School of Music for a master's degree, and Phil Markowitz and Dave Liebman were uh, teaching there, and both were just yes, the direction that they sent everybody in, at least for me, sent me to a lot of 20th century classical music, and I sort of had this like waking up moment, like why didn't I listen to this before? This is incredible. Um, and I think like I had been trying to reinvent the wheel a little bit, like I was writing all these really long form compositions, like that's what I was hearing, but I didn't have the um, in the jazz training that I had received up until that point, I hadn't like received license to kind of study things a little bit more deeply. Maybe that was just my own naivety. Maybe it was just the way that jazz composition is taught in schools these days. But
Sure.
or at that point at least. Um, so for me, like studying scores of uh, composers from the 20th century, helped me open up like my eyes to what was possible. Um, and I think that's kind of it. That's just like where I found a lot of my education to come from, was by listening to the people who'd sort of done all these sounds that I wanted to do already. I didn't have to start from nothing. I could start from like start on the shoulders of these other people who had done these things before.
Awesome. As you said, like by studying with the Liebman, it made totally sense
Mm-hmm.
that he would eventually suggest during this period those kind of listenings,
Mm-hmm.
even if he is more related with a more uh, how I can say it, like more concerned about utilizing those chromatic concepts
Yeah, yeah,
if he is in improvisation than utilizing on composition.
yeah. Definitely, his thing is more like the intense chromaticism of the first half of the 20th century, rather than more of the like timbral,
Sure,
microtonal, etc. worlds that come later. But the kind of spark of like taking this music and studying with it, that's sort of where that came from for me, for sure.
sure, wonderful, wonderful. So, as you were saying at the start of this interview, you was talking about some of the new release that will eventually came out in May.
Hmm.
Can you please talk more about the project behind it?
Sure.
You were talking about Idiom.
Hmm.
Would eventually continues the 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 evolving of this piece. So please, can you talk about this project? Who will play in, and yeah,
Yeah. So it's a 2 disc set called Idiom. The first disc is all my simple trio, which is myself, John Hollenbeck, Matt Mitchell. And then the second disc is a large ensemble that is um, how many people? 12 people plus conductor. And that is myself on tenor saxophone, flute, bass flute. Nathaniel Morgan plays alto saxophone. Yuma Usaka plays tenor saxophone, clarinet, and contralto clarinet. Erica Dicker plays violin. Joanna Matry plays viola. Marielle Roberts plays cello. Adam O'Farrell is on trumpet. David Bird-Marrow is on horn. Jacob Garchik is on trombone. Liz Kozak plays synthesizer. Nick Dunstan plays bass, and Satoshi Takeshi plays drums. So these are, you might know some of those names, some of them you might not. A lot of the people who you don't know are from the new music scene more than the jazz scene in New York. Probably most importantly, because I'm married to him, Eric Wubbles conducts.
Yeah. You're married with Eric Wubbles?
Yeah.
Wonderful. I really appreciate his compositions.
Yeah, he's wonderful in many ways. And yeah, so anyway, he conducts. So it's a lot of people that I have admired either from afar, like for their work in the new music scene, or have worked with in various contexts in the jazz world, but a lot of people who I maybe hadn't had a chance to like bring into my own music at some point.
Sure.
So it was super fun to write this piece for people that are coming from like a fully composed, fully notated background, all of them who have some experience with improvisation, and then also like sort of crew of people coming from the jazz world too, who are great improvisers. Yeah, so that's the large ensemble, and it was all recorded in 2019, thank God. The trio was recorded in April 2019, and then the large ensemble was recorded at the end of the year in December. And yeah, I'm super proud of it. I'm looking forward to getting it out in the world. I edited it myself, so I did all of the grunt work there, and then Nathaniel Morgan, who also plays alto saxophone in the large ensemble, he mixed it. He also mixed Clockwise.
Wonderful.
And yeah, so coming out on Pi at the end of May. I don't know if there's a date yet. I feel like there was a date, and then anyway, so sometime at the end of May.
Curious to hear it. Thank you so much, Anna, for this interview.
Yeah, totally. Thanks so much for having me.